this church has had a huge part of who I am. Might not make sense to most of you because you go to church here and you've never seen me here. But this church has a lot of history in my family. My grandparents went to church here. My grandfather was called to preach here. My Uncle Enoch lived down the hill in the green house that you passed probably coming to church. Granddaddy grew up in Dr. Stutt's house right down the road. More importantly, my grandfather was called to preach at this very church. I was thinking about the last time I was here, went for the greatest reason, I guess, if you think of it that way. I was here for my grandfather's funeral. I sat probably about the third row over there, and it's pretty emotional. I remember sitting there thinking, I wanted to get up here and tell people about my grandfather. Not that you didn't already know, the people that were here. Sorry to get a little emotional this last time I was here. I remember sitting there thinking, I'd like to get up here and tell people about how great he was. Because some of the people in the room didn't know him like I knew him. They didn't know what kind of mentor he was. But I sat there and didn't do anything. Kept waiting on the preacher to say, does anybody have anything they'd like to share? Didn't say anything, just sat there. My opportunity never came. I'll say that at one point the pastor said, I keep calling him pastor, preacher, y'all just bear with me on that one. Call them both, I guess. Could all the pastors in the group stand up? There was people all over the place standing. My grandfather has touched so many people that there was pastors here to support him in his arrival to heaven. So as I said, it was a hard day for us, but it wasn't a very hard day for my grandfather. So as we walked my grandfather across the street with my brothers and my other family members, I can remember thinking about there not ever being a man like my grandfather was. Never heard him say a harsh word about anyone. Never heard him cuss. Even when he got on to us, he'd set us in the corner, but not even facing the corner, facing away from the corner, which I don't know what that accomplished, but that's what he did. Spent a lot of summers with my grandparents. It really shaped a lot of who I am. So when I say what shapes you, that was one of the things that shaped me. So when I say my shape is a heart, I came from a heart, so that's why my shape is a heart. Spelled a little different. We don't have an E in a heart. So when I was preparing the material for what I was going to say when I got up here, I thought about a devotional. I thought about, talking about my history with the family. But then I started kind of thinking about sharing kind of how my heart, or how my body and my soul's been transformed by people in my life. I started thinking about how people impact you in a negative or a positive way. Not only people, but the things that you do, how you're impacted by what you say and what you do. And I got to think about mentorship and how I was mentored by my grandfather, how to be a decent human being, a good man. And I got to think about the Apostle Paul. For some reason, when I speak, I think it's my third or fourth time getting up in front of a church, I always talk about Paul for some reason. I guess because Paul, in his past, was one of the worst people ever. And Paul had a mentor, maybe I won't butcher this guy's name, Gamaliel is his name. And he was a Jewish scholar. And that Jewish scholar was a Pharisee. The Pharisees basically believed that you should follow the law of Moses to a T. Nothing outside of that. They believed it so much so that they created extra laws to protect the main laws. And Paul would hold everybody accountable to what he thought was the right way. And Paul forced his beliefs on others. His first appearance in the Bible was him serving as an official witness for the Jews as they stoned to death one of the first Christian martyrs, Stephen. He persecuted people that were followers of the way. He threw men and women in jail persecuted anybody that didn't believe the way that he did. I guess you've heard the story of the trip to Damascus. Paul was on his way to Damascus, about a 150-mile journey. When he was right outside of Damascus, he saw a bright light that overcame him. And he heard a voice that said, Saul, Saul. Apparently Saul was Paul. Paul was Saul. I don't know, they changed his name down the road. But Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Paul asked, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus the Nazarene, the one you are persecuting. Paul said, what should I do, Lord? The Lord told him, get up and go to Damascus. There you'll be told everything you need to do. That was in Acts 22, verses 7 through 10. So the encounter with Jesus made such an impression on Paul that he insisted it made him an apostle. And apostles were really the people that were close to the Lord, that walked with the Lord and actually knew the Lord. Paul was so blinded by the light that he had to have his travel companions to carry him on into Damascus. God sent a man named Aeneas to restore his sight. Paul was convinced, he was converted, and he was eager to tell the story about Jesus. He told people, indeed, he's the Son of God. So I got to thinking about how great that'd be. You know, if we're all just walking down the road one day and we hit a bright light, and God tells us what to do. How many people's ever done that? I'd say probably no one, right? It took divine intervention to change Paul's way. Paul wasn't on the greatest path. Paul was headed somewhere he didn't need to go. Paul's mentor shaped him. It shaped him, but it didn't have to define what his future was going to be. It took a reality check to gain perspective on how things should be. You know, I thought about my journey when I read this scripture. And I thought about Paul and how he had messed things up so bad, and his mentor was there to guide him and to teach him the way. And unfortunately, his mentor didn't teach him the right way. And it took God to step in to fix him. A story similar to that. I came to the realization as an adult that I'll never be what my grandfather was. Never will. I probably won't ever live up to his example. My life didn't start like his did. He had a pretty rough start. We don't have time for all that right now, but he had a rough start. When I started my journey, at 2 years old, my dad went to prison. I lived in a really nice house over by Gurnsville Lake. We were moved into a low-income apartment. If it wasn't for my mom, I don't know where I'd be at today. Taking care of my brothers and sisters and I. By the time a couple of years had went by, my mother remarried. When I said I was shaped by my grandfather, I was shaped by a few other men in my life too. My mother would remarry a couple of years later, and the man that I had in my life then wasn't like any man I'd ever met. My new stepdad had a lot of issues. He was an alcoholic. He was a drug addict. More importantly, he's an abuser, mentally and physically. Now, he didn't start off like that. My mother wouldn't have married him if he was like that starting out. He was pretty good at acting like he was something that he wasn't. Before the end of it, drinking every day, doing drugs. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up and go in the living room and see something laying on the table that he had done the day before. As a kid who knew about the Lord through my grandfather, that didn't seem right. I can remember getting spankings from him. I can remember how I know about it for weeks. And I know my sister's in the back shaking her head because she knows how that goes too. I can remember how he verbally abused all of us constantly. My mother more I went on to jump schools every year. There was times when I went to 3 different schools in one school year. So if you've been blessed enough to stay in one school, be thankful for that, because I did. I knew that one of the constant things in my life was the fact that I wasn't gonna ever have the same friends every year. I always seemed to get along with everybody, I always seemed to make friends, I always seemed to kind of get in a routine. People really liked me, and then we'd get told that night, hey, we're moving in the morning, and we'd move again. So by the time I was about 12 years old, I can remember going to church. My stepfather, I guess, had that bright light shine in his life and told him he needs to go to church. So we'd go to church on Sunday. Unfortunately, through the week, he was the same person. That made me pretty confused. 12-year-old kid who saw a grandfather that lived a life for God, but I had a stepfather that lived a life that was completely opposite. I can remember my grandfather preaching about how amazing God was and how he loved us all. I can remember being confused on how God would let somebody like me live that type of life. I was fortunate enough to go to a church camp up in Michigan. It's almost in Canada. They sent us up to this church trip, a mission trip, for a church camp, and went with my brother, and I can remember going up having reservations because I didn't know what they were going to do to me. In my mind, I thought, well, they're fixing to make me do something I don't want to do. So all the way up to Michigan, I was scared. Not to mention I was from Alabama, so I wasn't sure how if they'd understand me at all, for that matter. Got up there and learned a lot from the counselors there. We prayed a lot. They taught me a lot about God, and I thought, wow, man, everything I thought I knew from my granddaddy was right. I thought about when I came back, I was going to be different. I was going to read the Bible like they taught me to. I was going to start reading my Bible every day. And unfortunately, that didn't last very long. A few years later, stepfather found himself in prison. Second dad. I'd say that it wasn't just a blessing to me and my family. I'd say it's a blessing to him too. It's changed his life. He speaks in front of churches. It's really changed the man that he is. Unfortunately, I never got to see that. I ended up moving in with my dad, real dad, when I was 14. Stepmother attended church every time the doors were open. Probably heard that before. Dad didn't attend, but he insisted that we all go. Used to say, I did my time. That didn't sound right to me. I did my time. Started going to church every time it was open. I was around 17, I got saved and baptized on Mother's Day. It was 1995, if I'm not mistaken. By then, I had a good job. I'd say a good job, a job. I was playing varsity basketball, starting to think about, what I was going to be in life and focusing on doing things that were right. Going to church, had a good church family that loved me. Knew that I was trying to do right. I had one major problem that most boys at that age do. I had a girlfriend. That's all that I thought I needed. I also had what most 17-year-old boys consider they have, and that's the know-it-all mentality. How many people have ever had a teenager that knew it all? You probably were the same. Some hands are raising. So, 17-year-old, I knew everything. I didn't need anybody to tell me anything. I did probably one of the dumbest things I've ever done in my life in that know-it-all mentality. Jumped out there and got married. 17 years old. A couple years later, I had a little boy. Thought I knew it all. Just get a job, pay your bills, go to school, get you a degree, have money, have a nice house. Everything's going to go great. It's not the way it went. About 5 years later, I found myself divorced, alone, needing direction. Didn't know what to do. I did what most people do when things aren't going the way you want them to. Call on God, right? Anytime you need something, you call on God, right? Not any other time. So I asked God to help me, but I also made some promises. You guys probably know about that. God, if you'll just fix this, I promise you I'll go to church every Sunday again. God, if you'll just fix this, I promise I won't ever cuss again. I won't do things I'm not supposed to do. I just needed a quick fix. I need to get my feet back under me, and I needed to get things straightened out. Things didn't get better. I ended up finding me another girl, because that was the solution to every problem. Find you a woman, a good one. I mean, another girl a couple months later, she's pregnant. Whew. Still fixing my problems though, right? Unfortunately, I can't tell you a story about how we lasted 5 years, because we didn't. We didn't even last a year. Probably wasn't even but a couple months. Ended up separating, ended in a pretty rough relationship. Here I am, father of two different mothers. Whew, not good. Far from that example, Brother Bill said. Had a lot of shame. I can remember being shameful. Just remember people looked at me and they thought I wasn't worth anything. So me being the fixer, since I knew everything, I did what any sensible man would do. I joined the Army. Because if I joined the Army, people's perspective of me would change. I'd be that guy that's in the military that's fighting for his country. You know, maybe I got a couple kids, but hey, just right, you right it is wrong, all in that one thing. You know, fix my failure, so to speak. So I'll fast forward for the sake of time. Told Russ I wouldn't go over, but I'm going to attempt to keep this going. It gets worse. Just admit that. Several years later, several failed relationships, found myself married again. Similar to the first one, had 2 more kids. A couple years later, got rocky again. 7 years later, divorced again. It's not getting better. Now here I am, 4 children, 3 different mothers. Things are falling apart. I went through a period where I didn't know what to do. I was broken. About 12 years ago, I found my answer. I married for the 3rd time. Baggage in tow. I'm not calling my kids baggage, I'm talking about my history. My new wife had no kids. I was blessed that my new wife actually loves kids. So my wife and I talked about having kids. That was a tough conversation for me because I had kids. But who was I to tell her no? We got pregnant, lost our first child. Horrible moment in our lives. Got pregnant again, and Lord's playing tricks on me. I got pregnant with twins. So, man, you talking about trouble on the way. 1 boy, 1 girl, sitting in the back. My 1 boy and my 1 girl, I thought I'd solved it all. My wife never had kids, we got a boy and a girl, home free, right? Not in my wife's eyes. She told me, I've always wanted 3 kids. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I don't want another kid. I know, I don't want another kid. I got too many kids. At that time, I had custody of 2 of the other kids, had 2 twins living in the house, had 1 son grown on his way to college and another one fixing to graduate high school. And we're talking about another kid. I I'd like to say that it was hard to convince me, but it wasn't. We had another kid, lucky number 7. She's here today too. Couldn't imagine life without her. Sounds pretty bad, right? All I do is fail at what I do. All I do is mess it up. I guess you can already figure out how this story plays out. You see them back there, so you know she's not gone. That ain't when it turns right. It goes south from there. A few years later, after my wife and I got married, we started to struggle. Guess you guys can figure out the common denominator here. I've had this desire since I started dating, I guess, to be in control of stuff. I like to be in control because in that way people can't hurt me. My wife, on the other hand, doesn't like being controlled. Figured that out the hard way. A few years later, we found ourselves separated. I was living in an apartment with my brother. Got myself into trouble with my need to control. That's a whole separate sermon that I can preach to you one day. Maybe you'll listen. Used to treat my wife like property. Because that way, if I control everything she does, I wouldn't have to worry about her leaving me. I wouldn't have to worry about her doing something that would cause us to split up. I demolished all the trust she had for me. Pushed her away to the point of no return. She didn't want me or anything to do with me. I can remember staring at myself in the mirror, my brother's apartment, begging God for help for the 3rd time. Contemplated some dark thoughts. Contemplated doing things to myself. Kept hearing the same thing over and over in my head. You want to go to hell? Over and over again. I do feel like God blessed me that day and pulled me out of that hole I was in. I was a failure. Always been one. Now, in the process of all this happening, my career has skyrocketed. I'm doing really good at work. That's what I do, right? I'm in production. Hate to admit it in front of a church that this at Rogers Chapel, they had run out. I work for Jack Daniels. Stand in front of a church and I work at Jack Daniels. Don't sound right, does it? Operations supervisor. I get things done. It's funny when your employees think you got everything together because you always are successful. But at home, everything falls apart. Because at work, I control things. At home, I can't. So as you can see, my wife and I worked on our relationship. She's here, so she ain't left yet. Continue to work through the issues that plagued us. Mostly me. My mentality. We continue to work on those today, even this morning. Still mess up. Every day. A little over a year ago, no, I ain't got a lot of time, so I'm gonna try to push this last part through. A little over a year ago, I was at a football practice. And one of the people that went to church at Rogers Chapel, son plays on the same football team, said, "Y'all ever come to church Sunday?" Which she had done every single day, probably that I'd ever saw her. She said it every day. And my daughter, Kylie, number 7 back there, Daddy don't let us go to church because he don't want us to go to church. Tore me up. Broke my heart. Remember that bright light for Paul? Bright light. I knew my kids needed what I never got. Stability. In the same school since I started. Knew my kids needed stability, same stability I never got. That's why I do all I can to try to stay with my wife. So my house, it's the three. My wife and I, they go to the same school, go to the same church. Try to teach them what's right. Made a commitment that day to that individual that we'd be there on Sunday. One thing about me, I don't back out on my promises. And I've been there every Sunday since. We joined Rogers Chapel Church a little over a year ago. I continue to grow my family in God. I know without God I would have never made it through my life. And that's not a life anybody in this room ever wants to lead. I was shaped by a great man, my grandfather. Unfortunately, I was shaped by several men after that. I know without God now that I won't make it into my future. And I thought about this other scripture that you guys have probably heard 15,000 times, but I'm going to share it with you because it really translates well to me. It really, I think, sums up what I want you to remember from this conversation. It's in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 3, 5 through 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your path. The Lord's there for you. He's there when you're begging for help, and he's there when you're not. I couldn't control some of those circumstances. I didn't pick the men that were in my life. But I could control those circumstances in my adulthood. I got to think about Paul. Persecuted men and women, children, murdered them because they believed in God. If God can use Paul, one of the worst people in the past,